Welcome to Bled Talk, the podcast where insightful conversations meet language learning. I'm your host, Samuel Bledsoe, and on this show, we dive deep into a variety of topics with fascinating guests from all walks of life. Whether you're an English learner looking to sharpen your language skills, or simply someone who enjoys thought-provoking discussions, Bled Talk is something for you. From engaging interviews to solo episodes filled with knowledge and inspiration, join us as we explore the world one conversation at a time. Get ready for a journey of learning, curiosity, and meaningful dialogues. Welcome to Bled Talk. Welcome everybody this week to Bled Talk. I am super excited with our special guest we have. Her name is Jenn. She's from the Instagram page English with Jenn, and I'll have all of her links and everything in the comment section so you guys can check her out after you listen. But she has a lot of experience as an English teacher, and she has so many great tips that she shares on Instagram and things. And I've loved following her personally. And so I think you guys will absolutely enjoy this. And Jenn, I want to thank you for coming on to the show and for agreeing to participate. And also, I just want to go ahead and start with your story. Could you tell us a little bit about you and how you kind of got to where you are today?
Sure. And really quickly, please. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your easygoing spirit and the way that you guide your podcast. It's really a pleasure to listen to you, and you're doing an excellent job. So a little shout out to you.
Thank you. I appreciate
it. So my background is this. I come from the United States. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, which for some people, they know that as Music City. That's where all the country music comes from. And then when I was 14, I moved to Los Angeles with my father, and I was there for high school and college. Met a German man at my university, and he transported me on over to Germany. And the idea there was just to be able for him to finish his degree, and then we would move to New York. Well, that never happened. That was in 1996. And so my 6-month stay in Germany turned out to be what's nearly now 30 years. So this is now my home. And I have 2 kids, and I kind of stumbled into teaching. I studied fashion design. I was in Los Angeles, and I wanted to be a costume designer for film and television. And I came to Germany, and in the 6 months, you could only be in Germany legally as an American for 3 months, and that's it. And then you've got to go. Unless you find a job that does not take a job away from a German. And so teaching English as a native speaker was a legitimate way to get a visa or a permit to stay in the country. So I started doing it, and I fell in love with it. But I had to teach myself how to teach English. It was tough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so you've been in Germany for almost 30 years now. And how was that transition? Like, so you went to Germany expecting to be there just for a little bit, and then ended up staying a long time. It's kind of like my mom when she told me that she went and stayed the summer with my dad, right? And after college, and she never went back, right? They went for the summer and just stayed there for the rest of the time. And so
in Brazil.
This wasn't in Brazil. This was back in the States. But I'm from the St. Louis area. And so pretty close to Nashville. But yeah, my dad was from St. Louis. My mom was from Atlanta, and they met each other in Idaho. And then she went back with him for the summer, and they just decided to stay for the rest of the summers, I guess, and then continue on. It's crazy, right? Sometimes life, we have a plan, and then it takes us to do something else. And so, like, for you, kind of, how was that adapting to, German culture versus American culture?
To be quite honest, 2 things. To be honest, moving from Nashville to Los Angeles was a bigger jump. Because coming from Nashville, where it's very conservative and very familiar and people, and it's all about community and everyone helps each other. as long as you fit into the mold. I think that has changed today. People are way more open-minded, but back then it was very conservative. And then moving from there to one of the most liberal places in the United States. And there you could be anything you wanted to be. You could have purple hair and face tattoo or whatever, but there was no real sense of community. And for me, that was a bigger struggle than to then move over to Germany. It was still tough because I was so far away from my family. And this was in 1996. There was no internet. Making a telephone call was extremely expensive. Writing a letter, you don't want to do that because, people did, but it would take, by the time the letter got to my family, all of that information would be old. So it was tough in the beginning, but it was way more difficult to move to LA.
Really? I didn't expect that because I've heard a little bit about German culture, but like not enough. And so I thought maybe it was just something super different and it would have been difficult for you to adapt to. But how was learning German out of that? Because I know a lot of people tell me that learning German is not easy. Very far from it.
No, I came with a really good attitude. I'm going to learn this language. And actually, I had a course at a community college. It was my last year of university, and I took this additional course at a community college because I thought, let me learn a little bit of the basics. Let me be able to order something and speak with people a little bit. But all out of that course, I found out that there was the formal Z and the informal do, and you had to be very careful with whom you used what. So that's what I came with, but I came with, I'm going to learn this language. And I met this Irish guy, and he was like, "You're never going to learn this language. Forget about it." And I was just like, "That's such a bad attitude." And then after like 2 weeks, I'm like, "I get it. I'm never going to learn this language." I think it's really complicated. And to be quite honest, I am not one of these people that is naturally gifted when it comes to languages. And I think that's a little bit what makes me different as an English teacher is I have the utmost empathy with people because I have struggled to try to learn Spanish in high school in the United States and struggled to learn German. And I think a lot of language teachers come already prepared with being able to learn languages easily themselves. So there's not this like fundamental understanding that most people don't learn languages easily, that it's a bit challenging, and that, other tricks and tips and things have to happen because sometimes it's just not second nature. And so I think that helps my teaching. But it was not easy. It's still not easy. I have a very thick accent. I mix up the grammar all the time. But that's another thing is that I just try to get my students to speak because at the end of the day, people want to communicate with you. And especially when you come from someplace other, right? It's so interesting to meet new people. And so if people are worried about saying the wrong word or mixing things up, then they don't talk and they don't, interact with each other. So I try to let them loosen up and to feel like it's okay to make mistakes. That's not what life is about. It's not about being perfect.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think sometimes, like you said, I think people, they learn language. One thing that I notice a lot is that people, they learn a language and they forget the process that they went through to learn that language. And they go all of a sudden, oh, but it's easy. It's easy to speak English. Oh, it's easy to speak Portuguese, or it's easy to speak German. And I think that what happens is when we don't remember that process, or, when we're not actively participating in that process, that can cause a lot of issues. I always tell people that as much as I feel like I can say anything and everything that I want in Portuguese, I still try to correct myself. I still try and find the better grammar. I still try and find things that are going to make me sound better and make it easier for other people to understand me. Because I think that learning a language, like you said, it's hard. And I think for me, I don't think I'm gifted in learning another language, but I do think that I was always somebody who really liked to talk. And that was something that drove me to learn the language, because when I did come to Brazil, and I know I'll share a little bit of my story, how that started, but I came to Brazil as a missionary for my church. And when I got here, I didn't speak anything. I didn't know anything about Portuguese. I didn't study it. I had the basic Spanish from like middle school, and then a couple years of French from high school. But it was one of those things where, like, you learned language in the United States public schools, and we know that it's not super great. And so, we heard some words, and that was about it.
Yeah.
And it hasn't changed at all. It's everybody still goes through the same thing. And so I didn't really understand anything, but what I had to do is I had to talk to people. I had to understand what they were telling me, and I had a purpose. I think that's really important for learning a language too. Is like, for me, I felt like I needed to share the message that I had, and I was like, how am I going to do this if I don't speak their language? And I always tell people that we talk about learning languages, and people will be like, oh, well, how long did it take you to learn Portuguese? For me, I always tell people I could communicate like after about 3 months, and then after about 6 months, I felt like I could talk about most things, or at least I had enough to be able to ask about things that I didn't understand. And they're like, oh, that's crazy. That's really fast. And I said, no. The thing is it was like complete isolation from speaking English, and also just lots of pressure and kind of being forced to speak. And I tell people, people say 6 months, but they forget to mention how much longer you're going to spend crying at night because you just feel like you can't get it done and you can't do it. And so kind of like what you said, like when I talk to people and they tell me about how difficult it is to speak another language, or all the humiliation that they go through, I'm like, I get it. I know what it's like to go home and be like, wow, I can't do anything. I feel so dumb in a different language, because, in English, I can express myself really well, but then speaking in Portuguese, it was like, oh, I like blue. And like, that's the depth of my personality to people. And so, that's something that I think is really difficult to get into, to understand.
Oh, well, like, I mean, when you say with a crying thing, I remember too so many times where, like, you would enter into a conversation where there would be other people, and as the foreigner, they would be speaking German, and then at some point, or the foreign language, and at some point your brain just cannot take anymore, and you just kind of zone out. You're just like, okay, that's it. There is a limit. And I see that with my live streams too, where there are people that will write in and they will say, I don't understand. And I say, just listen to 10 minutes. Just listen to 10 minutes. This will be saved. Come back and listen to another 10 minutes. You don't have to listen to an entire hour. In fact, as a person who's just learning the language, even, a person who's pretty regularly sort of, can follow along pretty well, it can be just too much when you get so absorbed. So I respect, and my heart goes out to you for really absorbing and immersing yourself into the language, because that is a really tough thing to do. Right. I had the good and bad fortune of being in Germany, where they do learn a lot of English in school here. And I came here at a time where there were very few English speakers that were in the community. And so I was seen as a novelty, and like, yes, I can practice my English, which was bad for me because it wasn't good for my German, but it was good for my homesickness because I could sort of like be in two worlds a little bit.
Yeah. And how was that, like, the culture shock? Or do you think that you went through culture shock when you went to Germany, or do you think that like it was kind of easy to make the adjustment?
No, there was definitely a culture shock because Germans just think a lot differently than Americans. And I still have culture shocks all the time. And I've been here for 30 years. But then I go back to the States and I have culture shocks there. So I am at home nowhere and everywhere. Yeah, I think that like I would have moments where it just was too much German. I just couldn't anymore. Or like it's the weather here is really gray. And that was just not something that I was used to, having lived in Los Angeles for 10 years, where there are 2 seasons, and here there are really 4 seasons. And actually, like the main season is gray. Whatever gray is, that's what the season is. And so it was just kind of, that and the mentality where it's very serious here. And I think that as Americans, we often we're like big babies. That's what how I feel about us. We look to make things fun. We want to be entertained. If there's a task that's boring, why should it be boring? It should be fun. And here, Germans are way more pragmatic and like the task should be done and that it needs to be done. There's no fun involved. And that's good too, but like if you're not kind of like programmed that way, then after a while you're just kind of like, um
Where's the fun? Where?
yeah, like this can also be fun.
Yeah. Were
Yeah.
you able to go back to the US a lot in these the last 30 years, or was it difficult to come back for a while?
Yeah, I mean, it was always kind of like in phases. So before I had children, it was much easier. I would go back in January where it was super cheap and it didn't matter. Could go home, it just was easier. And then when I had children and they entered school, then we were, confined to school to the summer holidays. And then it was way too expensive. So we didn't do that very often. And then with COVID and everything, then I didn't get home very much. We were in New York at home last October. So that was nice. That was the first time since 2019. But yeah, and then that's an interesting experience too, because I don't know how long have you been in Brazil?
So the first time I was here for 2 years, and then I went back for about a year and a couple months. And then after that, now I've been here for about another 3 years.
Okay.
So in
But what
total,
changed
5.
do you do you see changes in yourself, the way you behave?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I had a conversation one time with a teacher from Australia, and she talked about, the first time that you do go home, like it's not home. It doesn't feel like home, and you feel like, and we talked about how it's almost like you expected everybody to just stay on pause until you get back. And then you get back and you realize that things happened and you're like, why didn't you guys wait for me? That obviously you don't say that, but like you
Yeah.
feel it. And then same thing when you go back to, when I came back to Brazil, I was like, oh man, everything is just going so fast. But then the second time going home was so much better because after
Okay.
that, I finally was able to kind of remember and be like, oh, okay, it's okay. Things are going to happen. I'm just going to go see my family. I'm going to go see people. I'm going to be able to eat food that I don't get to eat here. And then when I came back to Brazil, it was the same thing. Oh, I'm going to get to go back and eat special foods that I didn't get to eat in the States. And so I think after you go through that initial culture shock of like, I always tell people culture shock is that part when you start to hate everything at the same time. And then, and then after that, you start to, it's a more mature relationship, right? First, you're in love like you're a teenager. And then you hate somebody because you're like, oh, why did I do this? And then after that, you're like, you know what? No, they're good. I like them. But there are some things that I don't like, but it's a whole give and take. And I think that that's kind of how I feel about both countries. Is like, there are things that I love and there are things that I disagree with, but I always try to be positive and think of the good things that I get to. For example, right now I'm in Brazil, and so I want to take advantage of everything that I can that's here. And versus when I go back to the States, I want to take advantage of everything that I see there. And so it's an interesting trade.
Well, okay, to kind of keeping with that, if you don't mind, I have another question for you because
Sure.
you have this adorable baby. And, and I have two children. They're now adults, 19 and 22. But for me, I think that like when you raise children in two cultures, because even though my children didn't spend a lot of time in the United States, they still feel very American somehow. And they still really identify with the culture somehow. And so like if you could pick the thing from the American side of the culture that you hope that your child learns, and the thing from the Brazilian side of culture that, or I don't know, character, culture, attitude, something. If you could cherry pick from both, what do you hope that your baby?
That's a good question. I think I really hope that, because my goal is to maintain both cultures wherever we are, right? I was telling
Sure.
my wife, I was like, I don't want him to forget that he was born in Brazil. And I don't want him to remember that he's Brazilian if he lives in the States. And I want him to remember that he's American if he lives in Brazil.
Yeah.
But I think, like, I guess the top thing maybe from like Brazilian culture especially would be that I want him to here people are very close. They're very like, they like to hug and they like to talk. They're outgoing. It's like a hot environment, if that makes sense. Everybody just loves
Mhm.
to be with each other and talking. And not to say that Americans aren't that way, but Brazilians are a lot more than
Mhm.
Americans are. I know Americans are more that way than, for example, people from England, because I've talked to a lot of English teachers from England, and they tell me about those differences. And but Brazil, they have a lot more like family oriented kind of, like, oh, this is my, they know their cousins, they know everybody, and it's just, they try to stay connected. And I hope
I-
that he maintains that. I hope he keeps the spirit of being able to just talk to whoever's at the party and, have fun with it. And I think on the American side, I want him to have that sense of, this is a very American thing, I think, is that nobody is in charge of him, if that
Oh,
makes sense. I know that sounds a little a little too American, but like, because the thing is like, something that I think characterizes most Americans, maybe, I'm trying not to generalize, but I think most Americans, I always tell them that, like, we don't trust the government figure of things, like, ever. I was like, it doesn't matter who you talk to. They can be liberal, conservative, left, right, Democrat, Republican, libertarian, whatever. Both sides do not trust the government. Or we're raised to question the authority that people have. And I
it's
think
true.
I want him to remember that. I want him to have that in, because I see too many people, and this is maybe just my opinion, but I see too many societies, too many cultures just abraçar, that's a Portuguese word. They embrace somebody and they don't think about it. They don't think about what they represent. They just embrace what they're told, and that's it. And
Uh,
I really want him to be able to just question things and say, okay, well, is that really what we want? And I also don't want him to accept something that's not good enough, if that makes sense. Some places, they'll, for example, there's been people here who all say, well, why don't they change this if people don't like it? They're like, because you can't do anything about it.
uh,
Corruption is corruption, and you can't change it. And I was like, that's not, like, Americans don't think that way.
right.
We think, if we find out that there's something wrong that we don't agree with, a lot of times we'll try and get a group together and try and make that change. And, that is the story of the United States, I think, is that since the beginning, the people, the immigrants from Europe, they went there, they didn't like what was happening, they separated. Going further forward, there were a large group of people who did not want slavery in their country, and they fought for that, to change that. And going further, rights of different people and making sure that everybody truly gets to have that American experience. There's always been fights to make it happen. So the country is far from perfect, but I think that mentality of, I'm going to fight to make sure everything is the way it should be. I think that is a very
Yeah.
American thought, and I want my son to have that that was a little longer than I expected it to be, but
It's
that's
interesting.
that's what I think anyway. And what about you? What did you hope that your children would have from both cultures?
So from the German side, I think that Germans are really tolerant. They don't get enough credit for this, but I have done so many different topics when in a conversation setting with a group of people that were everything from young to retirement. And I could bring any topic to the table and people could talk about it like adults, and they could agree to disagree and walk away and not feel personally attacked. And I want my kids to have that. I want them to listen to other people's points of view. Kind of going in the same vein, I think, as you with your son questioning things. I think that, to be able to like really have truth, whatever truth is, right? Then, you need to be able to be tolerant enough to listen to other opinions. And I love that about Germans. And they don't get enough credit for that, but they really should. Because I brought some big topics to the table. I was like, boom, let's do it. And
Right.
there was never any flinching, and it just happened. And I love that. And from the American side, I really want my kids that when they have an idea, that when with the first obstacle, with the first barrier that comes, that it's not like, okay, that's it, forget it. And I feel like the culture here, they're so afraid of failing that they don't try. And I want my kids to try. And if they fall flat on their face, then you learn something. You pick yourself up and you learn from that and you move on to the next step. If it means something, if you fall the first time and you don't like it and you think this is no longer my baby, that's one thing. But you don't give up. You don't just find one obstacle and say, okay, forget it. Fight for what you like, go for what you want and try. You've got to try. And who cares what anybody else thinks? Just do it.
Absolutely. No, I like that. I think that's interesting, and I like that you brought that topic up because, or just that that question, because I think a lot of times people, they don't know how they want their children to be. There's a lot of bilingual or bicultural or multicultural households, and people are very confused on what we should do, right? And I think that when you both agree, when both parents agree that we need them to understand both cultures, I think that really opens doors, especially for kids, because like something that in the U.S. I think a lot of people have a problem with is that they're not very cultured when it comes to and no matter where it is, it's not even a right or left situation. It's just a matter
No.
that people may even think that they're cultured, but they're not. I can I can tell you that when I hear people talk about like culture and things like that in the US, it's very easy to tell if somebody has really actually learned about a new culture or if they're just, saying things that they think or that they read on a paper somewhere. Because I think I'm sure you had ideas that were very different of Germany before you went to Germany. And then you're like, oh, that's not what I thought, like,
Yeah.
I think Americans, when we think of Germany, unfortunately, we always go back to like the world wars, and that's like how people envision Germany, and that's not that's not what Germany is. And I think I think it's cool, and I think it's important that we share that with people too, that they understand that there is more than just what you expect. And how is that for you, like on your family side? How was it explaining it to maybe your parents or to just your friends and siblings, whoever? Like, how was it explaining what it's like being in Germany to them?
I think there are two types of Americans, if I'm going to generalize now. Those who just like itch to go abroad and really want to explore and see the world, and those that are like, why would you want to do that? And why would you not want to live here? Things are good here. Why would you go there? And I have always been an explorer. So, and most of my family They're not so much the adventurers. So I think there was a lot of like, just like sort of like, that's interesting, but I don't get it sort of vibes going on. And I understand it because actually, if you think about it, I live in a country now where it is totally normal to have at least 30 days of paid vacation every year. In the United States, we get 2 weeks if you're lucky after you worked at a place for X amount of years. And it's expensive. I live in Europe. I can hop on a train for 20 euros and I'm in Paris. I mean, one forgets quite often, I think, how far away, how removed from the other parts of the world, being in that section of the continent, the North American continent. I mean, there's not a lot of variety. You can go to Canada, you can go to Mexico, but even then, I find that, things cost so much in the United States that the average person, they don't even stand a chance to go abroad, even if they wanted to. And so, so I think that it starts also financially, mentally, and sort of just like within yourself, your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And because we're often kind of programmed to think of USA.
Right.
It's,
I think it has its place, right? It's okay. I always tell people, I think it's more than okay for you to be, patriotic. It's okay. It's the whole, like the new terms that have come up with, like there's patriotism, but there's also nationalism, right? There's two different ideas of it. And I think I always tell people, I would say that I'm a proud American, but I'm somebody who I enjoy the history that I have learned about my country. Now, is it a beautiful history? Some parts, but not everything. But I don't think any country does. When you learn about the history of a place, you should be a little disgusted with how it happens. And that's a normal feeling. It's good for you to see that because that means that you're going to try to avoid it. But I always tell people that I think some things in the U.S. That I really, for example, something that I miss are like little luxuries that for me, I didn't think were luxuries until I moved away and, I lived, because I also think something's important. This is one thing I think you have to remember is that if you go to another country and you have a lot of money, you're not going to have that full experience of, oh, this is what it's like to be in Brazil, for example. Because if you have enough money, you can buy almost everything that you would have in the U.S. here. And you can feel like you're in the U.S., but you're just in a different country. Whereas if you live here and you work here and you live the culture that the people have, you start to notice those differences and things. And so, like, for example, a car here in Brazil is super expensive. One car that we would buy in the States for like maybe $12,000 or like $15,000, here it's 100,000 reais, which is roughly like $20,000. So even even trading the currency, it's more expensive here. And on top of that, people here don't make the equivalent that people make in the U.S. And so having a car in the U.S. is a lot cheaper and a lot easier than having a car here in Brazil. And the same thing with a lot of other like basic necessities. There's things that they shouldn't be as expensive as they are. And, in the U.S., we always think like, oh, people are trying to rob us with the prices, but then we forget that in other places, if we're getting robbed, then they're just completely losing everything because it's just so expensive. Because it's interesting that you said that, because I haven't heard someone say that things in the U.S. are a lot more expensive than I know the traveling. Like for example, you said going to Paris is 20 euros, and I can't imagine traveling to Mexico City for $30 or whatever it may be. And so it's interesting to hear that. And would you say that like when you went to Germany, did you kind of already start traveling around and going to different places in Europe? Like you just kind of took advantage of the ability to do that, or did it take some time?
It took a little time. I mean, I came here when I just finished my studies, and my ex-husband, he was, finishing his studies. So we really didn't have any money. But we would travel a little bit, mostly stay within Germany. But since then, I've been to many countries in Europe, and I love it. For me, Europe is just this magical place. I always saw myself, even as a child, as living in Europe. I thought France or Italy, but Germany is great too. And but I always felt this sort of like, I need to go to Europe. There's something that's there for me. I was always drawn to it. So even though my family was shocked that I wanted to go, they weren't really surprised, because
Right
I would
there.
always, one day I would live in France or in Italy.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And a question I have for you as an English teacher, and I'm curious to know, so has it been easy kind of staying up with the changes in language since you've moved to Europe and started teaching English? Because I think a lot of people kind of forget that, like, for example, 90s English is completely understandable, but like there were different slangs and different things, and today there's different things like that. Like how would you, do you kind of keep up with that, do you think, or what do you do with that?
I do and I don't. I'm fortunate that I have two kids that are young adults, so they teach me things, and I always feel completely creepy using things. So like, but language changes, and that's totally normal. I guess, in all honesty, probably my English is slightly last century, or early this century, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I think that sometimes I stumble, and I'll occasionally say, "What do we say for that? Like, what do we say for that?" And I'm like,
Right.
"Ugh,"
No,
you
I
know.
get it. Yeah. Well, I ask because I have some students, for example, and they'll study, and they absolutely love movies from the 80s or from the 90s or whatever, well, whatever decade. And when they talk and they use some type of slang term, right? They try to use a slang and they say those things, and I'm like, wow, that is old.
That's that's a
That's
dinosaur.
right. I was like, that's already historic. But I
Yeah.
think about it, I'm like, but that's interesting because that's how they learn, that's how they acquired the language. And I thought that is important for me because in the future, in 10 years, 20 years, when I want to speak Portuguese, I need to make sure that I stay up to date with how people talk. Because if I come back and talk like somebody from, 2010, they're going to be like, wow, this guy is outdated. And so I think that it's interesting.
I think like with today with Netflix and things like that, and with social media, it's pretty difficult to fall too deeply into, you know, Shakespearean language.
Yeah.
I think that's not going to happen. But I think there's going to be the occasional phrase or slang word or vocabulary word where you're kind of like, feel strange using that, just because it's not something that you have used naturally with maybe other native speakers. That's what I encounter sometimes. So, but that's also getting older, right? Every generation has their own sort of way of speaking. And, the way that I spoke was definitely not the way that my father spoke. And that is also normal. So it's kind of a mixture thing. It's a generational thing. Maybe it's living abroad.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
No, that's cool. And how do you feel your accent has changed when it comes to, like, for example, speaking English, right? Because as natives, I think sometimes we don't realize it, but when we speak another foreign language so much, we change a little bit. When we don't hear our accent that we're used to, it kind of changes. For example, like I said, my mom is from Atlanta, and when she's in Atlanta, she has that thick Southern accent,
That's
and
awesome.
yeah, and it's great. I love it, because I grew up with it and I understand it, but I have some friends that when they listen to the Southern drawl, they don't completely understand how, what people are saying. I had a great grandpa who was from South Carolina, and one time I showed my wife because she's learning English at the moment. Um, and she learns the, like, how are you doing or how are you thing. But when she would listen to me, it would just be like, how y'all doing? And she's, what? I was like, yeah, no, that's normal. He said, how are y'all doing? Or how are you all doing? Right. But it's a lot different. And do you think that did you ever really have a thick Southern accent to begin with? Or do you think you kind of worked on it so that it's a little bit more like
That
toned
was
in?
part of my culture shock moving to LA. So I definitely had a Southern accent. But then when I moved to LA, that was when I was in the ninth grade. And it was that time and your teenage years where you were insecure anyway. And then you would have that had people crowd around me and say, say boat. And I'd be like, boat. Say five. And I'd be like, five. And I just felt like such a weirdo that I just sort of ironed that out. I think, though, that you hear it in the way that I speak sometimes. I think there's that Southern softness a bit sometimes when I say things. And definitely, like your mom, the second I'm in Nashville, slapping that thick Southern accent on for sure.
Yeah.
But mostly, and when I record videos, so many times I have to go back and record it again because I'm like, for your, and so I'm like, no, I don't want to sound like that. But I don't think that I've adopted a German accent. I think that sometimes in my English, the grammar, I will take some of the grammar structures and I'm like, ooh, where does that adverb of frequency go? Is that before the verb or after? Oh, or which preposition actually belongs here? And so I'll have to go back and take a look and sort of re-educate myself because you hear it in a certain way, or if your students say it incorrectly so many times, it starts to sound correct.
Nope.
So
I
yeah,
understand that one.
that can
It's one of but it's just one of those things, right? As an English teacher, we go through it, and I think it's interesting because for a long time I used to tell people that the Midwest didn't have an accent, and I was so wrong because I didn't realize when I went back to the U.S. and I heard people talking, I was like, this is what we sound like. That is weird. That's strong, But the thing is the reason why we say we don't is because the Midwestern accent is kind of like it's the news accent. It's what everybody hears a lot. And so it's
exactly.
normal. But
Yeah.
then, when I went back home and I heard someone talking and I was like, oh, that's how we say that. And when I do get back, it comes back a lot harder, a lot stronger. And but it's fun. I like listening to different accents and things. And
Yeah.
that leads me to one of my questions that I have for you, which is, what part of the United States is your favorite? And like, what part do you think is more, I would say, like, receptive of people, and just like where did you like the most in the US that you've been? Trying
Well,
not to be biased with home, right? But
yeah.
just,
Um, I really I feel unfair to the majority of the country because I really know the coast. I know the South and I know the coastal areas, the West, the East and the West. So the middle, I don't know at all. It's absolutely on my
don't
bucket
worry,
list.
there's nothing there.
Definitely I need to, want to. But so
From
place.
your experience, right? Everybody who's listening, she's not saying that, this is the best place, but just from what you've lived through, what you've been through, what place did you like the most?
So lived, I don't know. I never felt at home in Los Angeles. It was always a little too me.
Uh-huh.
Um, it was very open-minded, but it was just because everyone was focused on themselves. It felt like to me. That was my experience there. Beautiful place, beautiful weather, everybody's beautiful. But it just I need something with a little bit more
Homey,
substance.
right?
That was missing for me. And in the South, I don't think I could live in Nashville again. Even though it's nice and familiar and everything, I find like if to be in the United States again, I feel claustrophobic. I don't know that there would be one place I would want to really live because I love being in Europe. I love, for me, this idea of an hour, I'm in a completely different country with different cuisine, different architecture, different mentality, language, people, everything. For me, that's just this, it's paradise. I love it. But if somebody said, okay, Jen, you have to, we're taking you, we're dangling you here, and we're going to plop you somewhere in the United States, you better tell us where we're dropping you. New York City.
So,
but it would have to be in an area that is pretty quiet, because we were there in October and it was so loud with the sirens. And I never realized how many different types of sirens there are. They have a language of their own. We need to learn siren.
yeah, basically. No, that's interesting. Yeah, New York, I like New York. I always tell people that for me, New York is a great place to visit, but I don't know if I could live there just because I'm from like small town USA, right? And so for me, that homey feeling of, or that almost that safety, because I always tell people when we talk about like the safety of the US, we're not talking about the cities, right? The cities are not that's not the safe place. The safe place is just outside in suburbia, or like I said, I was even outside of suburbia. I was in the middle of the cornfields, and to me, I always tell people, like, as boring as it is and as it looks, there's something beautiful about the simplicity of living in a place like that. And I would love to go to Europe as well and learn, because I think that there's also simplicity and complexity at the same time in Europe as well. But I always tell people, like, when it comes to learning English, I think that the Midwest is probably the best for, getting an accent that's easy to understand and being able to communicate. But when it comes to hospitality and like people treating you right, I think that the South is the winner. Just not, and not because of like my mom was from there and that's like my family genes, but to me, the South, when it comes to food, I think that the South does food better than anybody else.
We win.
Yeah.
Okay, get a heart attack, but we win.
Right. No, the South does food better. And I think that sense of like homey community, we don't know you, but come on over and we'll give you a nice tea and something to eat. And it's just, it feels good. And I know a lot of people talk about, well, it depends on, what color you are, things like that. But I'm like, but nowadays, like in the heart of the South, like not, once again, staying away from big cities, most people are pretty open to who you are. And, if you're different, they'll talk to you and see what you are. They might talk about you afterwards, but to your face, they won't say anything. They have the whole bless their heart kind of thing. And
yeah,
my mom always told me, she's like, if someone says bless their heart, then just, they're about to say something really bad about that person.
I know, my brother. Oh, bless heart.
Uh-huh. And then,
Yeah.
then they spill the beans, right? But
Yeah.
I think for me, it would just have to be somewhere probably in the South, just because of that hospitality and that community that you can feel. But I totally agree with you. I think that, there's just so many different things and places. I also love traveling. After I came to Brazil, I'm like, you know what? Staying in one place forever does not sound like fun,
Yeah.
Going around and finding new things is always really good. But
yeah,
we are getting close to the end of our conversation. Hopefully this isn't the last conversation we have. I hope in the future we get to have more and talk more. But I just wanted to ask you, and we'll close with this, like what advice would you give to somebody who is moving to another country and they need to learn a new language, and maybe it's English, maybe it's something else, but what would you tell this person? Like, how would you prepare them for that, the things that they're going to experience?
Well, I think that knowing that there are going to be things that you don't agree with, and sometimes it takes you time to say, I'm ready to be able to do that, or I'm ready to be able to be that way. I think being true to yourself, following your gut instinct, trying to immerse yourself, but knowing when it's too much. And then retreating, allowing yourself the space to say, no, I need to do me and my culture right now. But then, filling up that battery and getting back out there and trying again. And I think, but I'm the type of person who doesn't like to jump into a pool. I like to inch my way in. I think you're more jump into the pool and, let the body adapt. So maybe it's more of an individual thing. But for me, baby steps is quite often a good thing. And allowing yourself to have the kindness that you're not going to know every word. I also say this to my students. Don't you have days in your own language where you can't think of a word, where you just feel a little slow, where it's a little foggy up here? Why would that not be the same with you in English? So cut yourself a little slack. Be kind to yourself. Some days it's going to be easy, and some days it's more difficult. So,
yeah. No, that's a wonderful answer. I appreciate that. And like I said, I think that is a great note to end on. I think that was some wonderful advice. And Jenn, thank you so much for accepting the invite and for coming on and talking with me and asking me questions. I usually don't get asked questions a lot, so it was a treat for me, because I have a lot to say, but I always try to make sure that they get to hear somebody else, and so I really appreciate that. Do you have anything else that you want to say before we finish?
I don't think so. Just that thank you very much for the opportunity to get to know you and to do my very first podcast. I've never done this before, done a million live streams. So this is it's my first. So thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Everybody else who's listening, thank you so much for listening to our conversation. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them on the video here on YouTube, or you can find us on our Instagrams and send us messages and or comment on any of our posts. And like I said, maybe in the future, if we have enough, we can come back and maybe have another episode where we respond to some of those questions. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jenn, and have a wonderful rest of your week. And we'll see you next time on Bled Talk. Thank you for listening to Bled Talk. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more content. We are on all of the popular podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and we're even on YouTube. Don't forget to send in your questions and your suggestions. Thank you once again, and have a great day.